are going to be talking about, yes, okay, we're being recorded, about framing and weighing. One brief disclaimer before we get started, which is that this is my understanding of these topics, and a lot of people will give you different takes on how to do these things or what they mean. I find that these are useful ways of thinking about them, but this is not gospel. Okay, so what is framing? Essentially, framing is giving the judge criteria on which to judge the round. And I've seen people do this so many times unstrategically, so they'll just be like, it's whoever makes people's lives better. And like, I get that that's an attempt at framing that's better than nothing, in the sense that you're probably actively thinking about, the criteria of the debate, but it's not going to help you, right? If the other side agrees on the framing, it's not useful framing. So you want to be doing this in a way that advantages your case, specifically your side and not the other side. So yeah, by the way, just a note on the seminar, if you guys have questions or want to interject any time, feel free to just unmute and do so. And yeah, I am happy to answer questions. So I kind of want to take you guys through what I understand as the best step-by-step procedure to do framing. So basically, the first thing that you should be doing is prepping both sides. This is like a general thing that will really take your debate to another level if you haven't started doing it already. In prep time, you do want to be thinking of both sides. That doesn't mean that you're spending, 7 or 8 minutes on one side and 7 or 8 minutes on the other. Obviously, that would not be a good use of your prep time, but depending on how much time you need to write your case, and especially if you're a second speaker, right, who is probably not as much prepping the arguments in depth, depending on your partnership, I definitely recommend that you spend the majority of your time, or a lot of your time, just thinking of what the other side's going to say. So that's both thinking of their constructive material and thinking of their responses to your constructive material. And in this case, I think there's a big focus, I would say, on thinking about what they're going to stake their claim on. So it's not just what are they going to run, what is probably their best argument going to be. And that's kind of where we get to step number 2, which is identifying the key clashes in the debate. So again, if you don't know what that means, a clash is basically a point of contention or disagreement in the round where both sides disagree on something. So for example, without giving any motion examples because my brain is numb, you might basically, if you're advocating for privacy and the other side is advocating for safety on and one of the clashes might be which one of those things is more important, right? Or it might be how do you best protect children or something, or what's best for the economy, whatever, right? Depending on the debate, teams are going to disagree over things. So you want to kind of, after thinking about both sides' material, ask yourself where those things intersect or disagree and what the most important disagreements will be. So then step number 3 is figuring out which side has an advantage on which clash. And this is probably the most crucial and integral thing to the way that I like to think about framing, which is that you're trying to figure out what I would call natural advantages that exist within any motion, because not every clash is created equal for both sides, right? Or rather, not every side is created equal under a clash. Think of, I was just prepping this with kids and I forgot what example I used. Let's do, this house would implement UBI over welfare. So if replace welfare with UBI. If you're on Gov, you are going to have an advantage on what kind of argument? Can anyone give me an example? Is there a specific argument you're going to have a better chance of winning? Anyone? Replace welfare with UBI. What is one of the best Gov arguments, and is it going to be the op response? Because if so, then you do have an advantage on that clash. Let's see. I might pick on people because that's fun. I'm gonna pick on Josh because I'm pretty sure he helped me prep this with the kids at one point. Josh, go.
Repeat your question.
Well, give me an example of a Gov argument under this house would replace UBI, or sorry, welfare with UBI, that the Gov, the Gov has an advantage on, right? So a clash that Gov's going to win in that debate if they do their debating properly.
UBI will claim a wider net of people, And welfare can only be given to like a capped number of individuals, whereas UBI always goes to like it's claiming the utilitarian benefit, basically, that it goes to everyone.
Right. So like number of people benefited. Another way to maybe frame this is like the clash over kind of the middle class, right? Like, because I think OP probably has an advantage on like the poorest of the poor, if that makes sense, because there's probably more money going directly to them, whereas prop or gov has an advantage on the like, you know, mid to lower class people who may not otherwise be eligible for welfare, and potentially upper class, but that's probably not where as much of the impacts lie. So yeah, for sure. Essentially what we're doing there is trying to figure out like just intuitively which, if you have to like walk yourself through the disagreement that's going to happen in the round or the clash in your brain, which side is going to come out on top, right? So maybe op has an argument, but there's like a really good gov response, so that's not a winning argument for them. But maybe they have something that is kind of hard to respond to, like in this case on op, the idea that the lowest income people are going to just get more money, right? Like that's just, it's very difficult to dispute that on gov, right? So that is key because of what you're going to figure out next, which is basically making the clashes that they have an advantage on less important. And kind of simultaneously, step 5, making sure that the clashes that you have an advantage on are seen as more important in the debate. So, oh God, I literally debated. Okay, here's a motion that I debated today. So hopefully I'll be able to give a good example. It was, this house would allow natural persons to buy votes. So basically pay someone not to vote, not buy votes. Those are different things. So basically not a company, but like a regular person would be allowed to pay someone else to not vote. So like we were on gov and we were not going to win, or depending on how you run this, actually, we kind of tried to win on this, but in general, I think many of us could intuitively think that it's going to be hard on gov to win the idea that like you are going to get good outcomes through electoral politics, just because this policy advantages people with money. And we know that like probably people who either like own corporations or just like of the 1% might be inclined to use this to their advantage by, you know, preventing like marginalized people in a swing state or whatever to not vote. So in general, it was going to be hard for us to win on that. So I'm going to leave out our case because it was a little bit more complicated on CG, but what the OG framing was, and I think this is an appropriate frame, is to essentially say they identified that op was going to win on the argument of like people being, marginalized people having their decreased electoral power. So they said, we're going to try to prove to you out the gate at the top of their speech, the first speech, why electoral politics are not going to be a good avenue for marginalized people to get rights or to get any kind of good outcomes on either side of the house. So essentially they said it doesn't really matter if you get this big hypothetical harm of like taking their votes away, because at the end of the day, things like gerrymandering, voter ID laws, lobbying, whatever, mean that you're not actually able to get that kind of advancement through electoral politics in either world. So they said, actually, we don't care about that. The system is corrupt. Both options are bad anyways also. So instead of voting for the lesser of two evils, let's just take the benefit of getting money. And that was strategic in the sense that they kind of predicted what op was going to try to win on and tried to make the wins insignificant out of the gate. So that is essentially what I'm trying to like explain here, right? Is that you want to figure out who's going to be winning which arguments and figure out where to hang your hat on, i.e. in their case, on the fact that you just get money and that that's a good thing, as opposed to what op is going to hang their hat on and try to make that be seen as less important. So yeah, and then last step is like, you really want to take their hypothetical best case and preempt it or do pre-buttal, like basically saying why, like another layer that they could have added in this round is to say that it's bad for you to, or to say that it doesn't matter if people try to steal your votes because like, maybe that's not going to happen in the right places. Like maybe these people are bad at determining, you know, which votes they need to cancel or whatever, right? Like I'm just making stuff up, but the idea is that you're also kind of mitigating their harm directly. So you're directly preempting their argument. Reduce bureaucracy and management as an argument for, oh wait, Joseph, do you want to speak up about that? Because I didn't see when you sent that, so I don't know.
Oh, I sent it like
was in reference to.
about 9 minutes ago.
Oh yeah, I can't see the chat very well. Was that about the, oh, it was about the UBI. Yes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so reduce bureaucracy and management is definitely an argument in favor of UBI. And so you would want to frame, like if that's one of your better arguments, which I would say probably like overhead costs is at least, that's almost like, I don't know if it's your best winning argument, but it's a way to kind of make it like to mitigate your biggest loss, which is the fact that you're spending more money. So you can just kind of add that as a buffer to your argument to say, you know, like maybe they are winning on the idea that they can give more money to poor people, but it's not actually that much more money because at the same time, overhead is really expensive. So you cut that when you do UBI and give it to everyone. And therefore, like, again, that's kind of mitigating their argument, right? Preempting their argument to say that even if they tell us that they're giving it to the people who need it the most, like we would still be able to give a decent amount of money to every person, essentially. Okay, so do we kind of understand framing as a concept? Maybe we can take questions also, but I do want to briefly talk about weighing, if it'll let me switch slides. Weighing, right? So this is, I kind of like to think of this as like a thing that goes hand in hand with framing. So again, and just to clarify, framing is something that you do at the top of the first speech, in my opinion, but technically you could do it wherever. It's just helpful to kind of make it clear that like your argument's going to be more important and theirs is going to be less important out of the gate. But in terms of weighing, so this is kind of something that people tend to characterize as something that happens later in the round once the arguments have actually been made, but you can also do it earlier on as well, like in a PM or LO speech. Basically, you want to explain why your argument should be valued in the round, and you can do this through direct comparison, like weighing your argument in comparison to their winning argument, or just on its own, like why the argument should be weighed highly. So that's typically something you would do if you haven't heard the argument yet, or you're like unsure exactly what they're going to run, and you're like just weighing it while you're constructing the argument in PM or LO or member of Gov, member of Op. So here's a few metrics to weigh on. I like made these up. So once again, not gospel. I also have more that I've made up if you want to hear them later, but for now, 6 of them. So certainty, this is pretty straightforward, right? How likely something is going to be, how likely something is to happen or to be true. So maybe like, so actually to kind of bring in our closing government extension in the vote canceling round, we talked about how leftists could use this to create change on a micro level, like on a local level. And so the way that we tried to weigh that against a lot of like arguments that we heard from Op that were a little bit more of a stretch. I don't even remember what they were, but you kind of, I trust you guys to have a good gauge for when something is a big stretch. And so we were essentially weighing this on the basis of certainty. It's like, oh, whoops, even if you can't make huge amounts of change, or even if the margin on the local level that you get from canceling like some random white guy's vote is relatively small because progressives tend to do better on the local level, like that's especially in like big cities, even though that impact is not huge, we are really certain that it's going to happen for a variety of reasons that if you had seen the round, you would know, right? So if your mechanisms are really solid, I think that that's a good way to weigh your argument if you think that this is like a thing that we're fairly certain is going to happen, whereas maybe they have a big impact, but we're less sure that it's likely to occur. Frequency is like how often something happens. So you can argue that, for example, if you're talking about an argument about microaggressions and like why mitigating them would be a really big thing. Again, it's not because each microaggression is such a like catastrophic event for a person to experience, but you could advocate for the fact that because it happens so often, it should be weighed highly as an impact in the debate. Then there's also reliability. So like how well something might hold out under different conceptions of the round. This is a little bit harder to conceive of. So if it confuses you, probably let it go because it's not as common. But like essentially, you might see a lot of debate rounds where teams disagree over basic conceptions of like either the model, like, you know, is this debate occurring only in the global north or what about the global south? Or like definitions of certain terms. So like when we say, I don't know, like voting, do we mean the local level or the federal level, or just kind of like different conceptions of how the round should be weighed. So like principled arguments versus practical arguments. Regardless, like if there's disagreement over kind of what the round is about, like the most fundamental stuff that is supposed to make the debate like less messy, then sometimes one of the best ways to win it is to say, you know, the debate has been really messy, but our argument kind of caters to different circumstances. So even if this happens, or even if we believe this definition of this thing, our argument is still true. So that kind of cross applicability or reliability of your argument is another way to tell the judge that they should consider it highly in the debate. There's also, this is covering it, but I believe it says quantity. Yeah. How many people are effective? Really, really simple. So by the way, you might kind of notice that the purple ones on the left are a bit more mechanism oriented, and the ones on the right in pink are a little bit more impact oriented. I just tend to organize it that way, but the idea is that you're trying to highlight what is so robust about your argument that needs to be taken into account by the judge. So when you're talking about the impact, it could be because it it affects so many people, right? So I don't know, you can think of how to weigh that. For, you know, whenever I try to make arguments about cognitive disabilities in debate rounds, and I always lose, but that's another story, I tend to like try to help people conceive of the fact that even if we're talking about something like ADHD or just being on the autism spectrum, like those things are incredibly common, and not as like people tend to believe that they are quite rare, but they're actually incredibly common. So if you can kind of paint the picture that a lot of people are affected, even if those people are not individually affected that much, then you can make your argument seem impactful. Then severity. So again, if your argument doesn't impact that many people, but it impacts each person a lot, like an argument about legalizing all drugs to protect drug addicts, even though drug addicts are not a huge part of the population, you can say like it's often the difference between life and death, like surviving versus not surviving a potential overdose, if you could like go to the hospital and not fear legal backlash, or that your drugs, you know, are like regulated and there's no substances in them that could cause an overdose. So again, the point being that if you are advocating for like a life or death impact or just a really big impact on one or like a small group of people, severity is a good way to weigh your argument. Vulnerability is basically to say that like the people who we're talking about protecting with this argument, or like are a very vulnerable group who essentially are already at risk or already suffering. And especially when you're talking about like the state's obligation, that can be a really compelling way of saying it, to be like, listen, the state has a specific obligation to protect people who are already vulnerable, often because they also already screwed them over. So those are ways to think of weighing your argument, i.e. telling the judge why your argument should be considered important in the debate. And you'll see that that kind of in many ways links to the idea of framing. Like it's almost as if framing in some circumstances is it like you setting up the things that the like I tend to think of framing as more like strategic, like blowing up of your arguments and shrinking of theirs, but in many ways you're also kind of setting up ways that you think your argument is going to be seen as important. So you might say that winning argument is irrelevant because it only impacts a few people, right? So you can kind of see the similarity there, that probably your second speaker would follow up, and when they're weighing the round explicitly, compare that, compare it on that basis. So hopefully that made some amount of sense. Basically, if you could take one thing away from all of this, it's that when you're making arguments, you should be figuring out, it's not enough just to make a good argument, right? You should be figuring out how to advantage that argument, because once you start hitting really good teams, they're also making really good arguments. So the thing that decides a round is not how good your arguments are, but how important they've been made to seem in the debate. And I think framing in terms of like from the get-go, setting yourself up in a position where your clashes that you're winning on are seen as really important, and the ones you're like winning on are not seen as important, is a really good way to do that, as well as weighing to prove that, you know, you've already said these things, or you're about to say these things, and they're a lot more important than the other things the other side has said. Or again, if you don't know what they're going to run, you can just be like, well, you know, we're like, it's not that this argument impacts a lot of people and their argument doesn't, it's that this argument in general just should be weighed highly because it impacts lots of people. Okay, so if you were confused, or if you weren't confused, either way, if you would like to discuss more about this topic or anything, I'm not here that often anymore, which is kind of sad, but like I'm very happy to chat with anyone, especially novices, about anything regarding debate. So those are my contact info things, and yeah, I hope you guys had fun and enjoy your rounds. Let me see. Also, if there were questions in the chat, I'm sorry because I couldn't have. Oh, I didn't see them. But if you for half an hour
Oh, sure.
before my class.
Micaela, I think you'll approve of the motion.
Oh, that's exciting.